Hello, and welcome to the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link Transplant Clinical Trials Explained and Examined and Why It's Important to Consider It webinar. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. A question and answer session will follow the formal presentation. You may ask a question at any time by typing it into the Ask a Question feature on the left side of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. It's now my pleasure to turn the call over to Jennifer Gillette. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are really excited to bring you this clinical trials webinar, which is sponsored by the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And we're hoping that you get a lot out of this presentation today. Just so everyone has a brief outline knowing what we're going to talk about, first we're going to have Dr. Asif Alavi, who's going to give us an overview about clinical trials. Then we're going to have Abbey Fueger share with us how to navigate the maze of clinical trials. And then we have some patient experiences we're going to share with you today. One from Mike Ansley and another from Ray Gillespie. And then when everyone is finished speaking, we're going to have a question and answer period. So if you get a question, feel free, like Kevin had shared, to put that in the question portion. And at that part of our program, I will start reading and trying to answer as many as we can today. And just in case anyone here doesn't know about nbmtLINK, or the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, just want to give you a couple brief things about us today. First of all, we're an organization dedicated to helping individuals and their families from diagnosis through survivorship. We work with hospitals, cancer centers, and other organizations to reinforce and complement medical care by providing resources, support, and education. We link you to experts across the country in all kinds of topics related to transplant and to others who have made this journey before you. And right here, in case anyone wants to get in contact with us, this is our 800 number at the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link. This is my lovely executive director, Peggy, and myself with our emails. And in case you're not aware of the resources we have several to support you on this journey. We have our Lunch and Learn programs, an award-winning Marrow Masters podcast series. We have multiple webinars like the one you're on today, and blogs from those who have been through the transplant process on all things related to disease-specific information, survivorship issues, coping, and symptom management. We have a peer support mentor program for patients and caregivers, our second birthdays recognition program, several books and materials, and we have emotional support from a licensed social worker. We also have resources and stories of support via our Twitter and Facebook pages, so keep an eye out for those. Again, a special thank you to Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which Abbey is from, and I have to say they are just so helpful to us and all of our programs, so a giant thank you. And just a medical disclosure before we start today, the presenters we have are not recommending or endorsing any specific products, therapies, websites, or clinical trials. The treatments, therapies, products, trials, and websites mentioned during the webinar are provided as a convenience to you, and it's all about having individual discussion with your doctor. So this is not medical advice. This is you learning more so that you can have a great conversation with your doctor. And these are all of our esteemed partners that make these programs possible, so thank you to all. Sorry here. And now I'm going to introduce you to the speakers we're going to have here today. As I said earlier, we have Dr. Asif Alavi, I'm so sorry, and he's an assistant professor of Hematology-Oncology at Wayne State University and the Karmanos Cancer Center. Dr. Alavi earned his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his medical degree from the University of Michigan, go blue, a medical school. He completed his residency in internal medicine at UCLA and his fellowship in hematology and oncology at the University of Southern California. He is board certified in internal medicine, hematology, and oncology. He is currently a member of the transplant, cellular therapy, and hematology teams at Karmanos Cancer Center. His clinical and research interests include hemoglobinopathies and stem cell transplant for benign and malignant diseases. He has numerous abstracts and peer-reviewed publications in the field of stem cell transplant and hematology. He serves as the director of the Hemophilia Treatment Center at Detroit Receiving Hospital and is the primary investigator in the Sickle Cell Disease Clinical Trial Network. Dr. Alavi is active in numerous academic, departmental, and community organizations, including the Wayne State University IRB. He has been recognized for his excellence in teaching, winning the Karmanos Hematology Teaching Award 3 of the last 4 years. So thank you, Dr. Alavi, for being here. And then our next speaker will be Abbey Fueger. Abbey is a clinical trial nurse navigator with the Clinical Trial Support Center of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Prior to her current role, Abbey was a clinical research nurse at the City of Hope National Medical Center. And during her time there, she carried a portfolio of hematology phase 1 to 3 trials. And then we have Mike Ansley. He is a native of Silverdale, Washington, enlisted in the Navy in 1989. He graduated from the University of Washington in 1994 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering and completed a Master's of Science degree in Management of Information Systems in 2002 from the University of Central Florida. He is a career submarine warfare officer. He retired as a commander in 2013 after 23 years of distinguished service. His personal decorations include the Navy Submarine League's Charles A. Lockwood Award for Professional Excellence, and then the Meritorious Service Medal, 2 awards, the Navy Commendation Medal, 4 awards, and Navy Achievement Medal, 5 awards, and various personal and unit awards. In 2015, he relocated to Merritt Island, Florida, and works for a Naval Ordnance Test Unit at Cape Canaveral. He's married to the former Christy Moorcroft of Seabeck, Washington, and they have 3 sons, Jacob, Zachary, and Nathaniel. And then our last survivor speaker is Ray Gillespie. He will be joining us. He found a large knot near his hip in February 2019 and had Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he is a grandfather, a father, and a survivor, and will have a story to share with you. So without further ado, I just want to thank everyone again for being here today. And I am going to hand it over to Dr. Alavi and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Again, my name is Dr. Alavi. I currently work at the Karmanos Cancer Center and Wayne State University. And as Jennifer mentioned, I'm very active in clinical trials here, as well as serve on the Institutional Review Board for Wayne State University, which we review hundreds of protocols every year. So I wanted to talk to you based on my experience both running clinical trials, talking to many patients about clinical trials, and also being on the back end in terms of reviewing clinical trials and making sure that they're done in an ethical and sound fashion. So we'll move on to the next slide here. So clinical research more broadly is referring to any type of medical research involving people. There are 2 types of clinical research broadly that can be divided up. One is observational studies, and these are studies in which there's no specific intervention or treatment, but rather patients continue on their routine care and we're observing outcomes. And I'll go into a little bit more about that in a second. And then there's clinical trials, which will be more the focus of this talk. And this is what most people are familiar with, where you're in a study that's testing a new drug or therapeutic to see how well it works. So observational studies, the goal of an observational study is really to assess a health outcome in a group of particular participants without assigning them to a particular intervention. So an example of this would be in the stem cell transplant setting would be looking at a particular risk factor R. Like let's say there's a blood test, for example. And you test all the participants for that risk factor, and then you just see what happens over the course of the routine care. And you say, okay, if you have risk factor R, does that mean that you're less likely to be successful with transplant than a person who doesn't have risk factor R? Again, we're not necessarily giving any treatment. We're just seeing what happens based on the presence or absence of that risk factor. A clinical trial, however, is going to evaluate a particular medical, surgical, or behavioral intervention. And these can be designed in different ways. They can be single arm where, for example, everybody that enrolls in the trial will receive the treatment. Or they can be controlled where there'll be one arm that receives the treatment and there'll be a separate arm that either gets a standard of care, or I put it in abbreviations SOC here, or placebo. And really the goal of clinical trials is to assess for both the safety and the efficacy of these treatments. So again, another example in the transplant setting here is that you have a new treatment, which I label T, and you're going to compare it to the standard of care and to see if it's better at treating acute myeloid leukemia. So clinical trials, so interventional clinical trials, they are going to be developed in different phases. Phase 1 are usually called first-in-human studies, and these are newly developed medications or therapies that are being tested in humans for the first time. And really the goal of the phase 1 is to assess safety. We want to, and oftentimes this is done in a dose-escalating fashion. So it'll start at a low dose, then if that's well tolerated, the next group of people will get a little higher dose, and if that's well tolerated, it'll go higher, etc. And what they'll try to find is they'll try to find the safest, the best dose that's safe and maybe efficacious. Phase 2, you start to get a few more participants involved, and the idea now is let's see if this medication is actually helpful, is it efficacious? And so these are oftentimes single-arm studies where everyone will get the treatment and they'll get a sense of does this treatment work or does it not work. If it looks like it's promising and we see that, you know what, this medication is working or this therapy is working, it usually goes on to a phase 3 study. And this phase 3 studies are very large. They typically involve multiple sites, and they're oftentimes randomized and controlled, which I'll go into in a second. And essentially what this is comparing the current treatment to the standard of care so that we can establish a better treatment. And this is usually what the type of study that's necessary in order for a therapeutic to be FDA approved. And then a phase 4 study is just post-market and long-term studies. So after a drug's been FDA approved, oftentimes there are studies that are done afterwards to see if they can pick up any other side effects or other signals of where the drug could work or not work. So common aspects of trial design, some of this I kind of hinted at. So controlled. These are oftentimes studies that are in the phase 3 phase. And these are essentially where you have a treatment arm where there's going to be people receiving the treatment, the study treatment, and then a control arm where patients will receive a standard of care. Sometimes, if there's no good standard of care, that treatment arm could be placebo. And then there's other times where, for example, you may receive standard of care plus placebo. So they can be done in a few different ways. Randomized essentially means that people are randomly assigned to one arm or the other. So you can kind of think of it like flipping a coin. So people are either going to get the control arm or the study arm. And in order to decide which arm you go on, there's a computer algorithm that essentially randomly places you in one arm or the next. And this is to allow both arms to be unbiased and fair, so we can have a true sense of which treatment is actually better. And then the last term that you'll oftentimes hear is blinded. Blinded essentially means that the person who's getting the treatment and or the person who's giving the treatment doesn't actually know which treatment you're assigned to. And this is a very important principle in trials to avoid bias. So in particular for treatments where there might be a subjective or something where a patient might have a symptom that they need to report and not report, if they know or the investigator knows that they're getting the study drug versus placebo, for example, it might bias the way they report it. So we in these cases, we want to blind the treatment so you don't actually know what you're getting. One thing to mention, going back about blinding, is that if there's ever an issue of concern for safety, or oftentimes even after the study is completed, it can be unblinded, so you can find out what arm you were placed on if there's a concern for safety. So who are the key players in the clinical trial? Well, obviously the investigators. Those are the people who you're going to be interacting with. And when you look at your clinical trial at your site, you'll notice that there's someone listed that's the principal investigator. And that might not be the physician who's treating you. And the reason is that there's going to be multiple co-investigators at every site. So the principal investigator is the person primarily responsible for the trial at the site, and they're the ones that are reporting the information and going over the information. But all the co-investigators are very familiar with the clinical trial and able to treat people on clinical trial. There's going to be a research nurse who interacts with you, oftentimes is taking samples, having you fill out forms, arranging appointments. And then a research coordinator who's going to be kind of more in the background, and they're the ones that directly interact with the sponsor of the clinical trial and will be collecting data, reporting data, etc. And then there's regulatory personnel, and these often involve getting IRB approvals, contracting, etc. And again, these are people who will be in the background that you won't necessarily interact with. So one question that often gets asked are clinical trials safe? Is this something, oftentimes people who don't have a lot of information about clinical trials are very skeptical about these. And then you've heard bad stories about clinical trials. And definitely, historically, there's several reports of very ethically problematic clinical trials that have been conducted. And because of this, actually, clinical trials today in the United States and abroad are actually highly regulated. So there's actually very well-established protocols and standards that are international standards and protocols that have to be followed. And all clinical trial staff have to have been trained and certified in these. So for example, we have to do good clinical practice training and human subjects protection training. And anybody involved in whether they're on the clinical research staff, whether they're investigator, whether they're a nurse, has to be trained in these standards. Additionally, there's multiple layers of protection. So the investigators and the site research staff will be monitoring for side effects, reporting side effects. The sites have a specific scientific review even before the study opens, looking at the study and saying, hey, does this make a lot of sense? Is this scientifically valid study that we should be putting patients on? Then again, every institution will have its own institutional review board. And having served on the institutional review board, we spend a lot of time going through protocols and looking for any small issues that could potentially compromise patient safety. Further, the sponsor will be looking at all the information, again, internally looking to see if there's any problems or any safety signals. And particularly for large trials that might be present at multiple sites, you'll typically have an independent data safety monitoring committee. And so they'll actually look at the data, they'll put it all together from different places, and they'll say, hey, do we see that this number of people are getting the side effect that might be to the drug, and maybe this drug's not safe? And then finally, the government regulatory authorities which would be the FDA in the United States, and then the EMA in Europe, are involved with oversight over trials and then the final approval of therapeutics. Additionally, any patient that's treated on clinical trial there has to be strict adherence to the study protocol, which will dictate how patients should be monitored, whether if they have a side effect, the study medications need to be stopped, held, reduced, etc. And so there's a lot of careful monitoring and reporting of adverse effects. So clinical trials today are done in a very, very careful, coordinated fashion with a lot of ethical standards. So why do people participate in trials? So there's many different reasons why. It could be that there's no other reasonable treatment option, that your physician who's treating you says, we've exhausted all treatment options available, and really what option would be to just do supportive care, or we have this clinical trial available that might offer you some benefit. Sometimes it's done earlier in the course of treatment, and there might be a therapy where we say, this therapy might be better. It could be better because it works better, or it could be better because maybe it has less side effects than the standard of care. And that might be another reason why a person decides to participate in a clinical trial. Sometimes the motivating factor for patients is that they just want to contribute to general knowledge of disease and advancement of care. And that's actually, to be honest, the primary reason that clinical trials are done. That's how we got to the way we are right now with treatments, is because of patients participating in clinical trials and us learning. Not all clinical trials are going to be quote-unquote positive, meaning we're going to have the outcome that we desired. But in every clinical trial, we do learn. And finally, sometimes clinical trials can be an important way to access therapies. So sometimes therapies, particularly now, therapies can oftentimes become very expensive. There can oftentimes be high out-of-pocket costs. Sometimes insurances don't approve them. And thus, a clinical trial may be the only way to access that particular type of therapy. So when you start considering a clinical trial, and you go and talk to your physician about clinical trials, what types of questions should you be thinking of? What types of questions should you be asking? So first of all, you want to know what the standard of care is. You always want to know, what would you do if I didn't participate in this clinical trial? Secondly, then, and related to this, is how will the clinical trial differ from this? Because it could be very well that much of what's being offered in a clinical trial is the standard of care, and there's just a slight deviation from that. And you want to know, what is the difference? How is the clinical trial going to be different? You want to ask what the risks and benefits are. And then also financial considerations. And I think Abbey's going to go over this a little bit as well, but sometimes it's important to know that not necessarily all things will be paid for. So for example, anything that's standard of care, oftentimes the clinical trial won't cover. It'll go be billed to your insurance like it normally would. Additionally, on rare occasions, some insurances have riders in place where they won't pay for the standard of care if a patient's on a clinical trial, and you want to know that if that's the case. Finally, you should always review the consent form. I think that's my next slide, is what do you do with the consent form? So one thing is sign without reading consent. And this happens more often than I would like. A lot of times patients, they trust in our judgment, and if we tell them that, we offer them a clinical trial, they'll just sit there and they'll sign it right in front of me. And I'll tell them, stop, do not sign this. You need to read the form. And I think this is just a common thing that if you're going to sign something, you need to read it. And I'll always make patients take the time, 15, 20 minutes if they need to, and read the whole consent form before I let them sign it. If they don't understand it, I'll go through it paragraph by paragraph with them. But it's very, very important that you understand what you're signing. I've also seen the flip, that people read a consent, they get scared by reading it because it is sometimes scary sounding, and they decide not to participate. And one of the reasons it can be scary sounding is that the way we oftentimes present treatment in a consent form is much more involved than how we would discuss treatment normally. So consent forms can oftentimes be 30 plus pages long and have long lists of side effects. And I've actually had patients, for example, refuse to participate in a clinical trial because they read a side effect and they're very scared of the side effect. But it turned out that that side effect was actually in the standard of care, and the treatment arm that they could potentially get randomized to didn't have that side effect. And I tried to explain that if we don't treat you on the clinical trial, then you're going to get the standard of care which has that side effect. But the patient was so scared of seeing the side effect in that consent form, they did not want to sign the consent form. So it's important to understand and discuss and clarify any questions you have when you when you review the consent form. So essentially, when you review you should always read the consent form and then ask clarifying questions on anything you don't understand. So what questions should you not ask? And again, I've had all these questions multiple times. So one is that, is the clinical trial better than standard of care? Well, no one can honestly answer that question, because if we knew the answer, we wouldn't be conducting the clinical trial. The clinical trial is done to answer that question. So honestly, we can never answer that question. The second question I often get is, should I enroll in this clinical trial? And again, we can recommend it as an option, but in the end, it's a personal decision. And we can never say that, should you do it or should you not, because it's experimental, there are risks, and because we don't know what the efficacy of investigational medication is compared to standard of care, we can never actually say for sure, yes, you should do it or yes, you shouldn't. And the final question I actually get a lot is, would you recommend this for your mom, dad, etc.? And again, I don't like to answer this question because I think it's biasing. My mom isn't, the patient. The patient is not my mom. They have a whole different set of circumstances, different values, different medical conditions, different diseases, maybe even. And so for me to answer that question is not a fair question. It wouldn't be a fair answer, I should say. So once you've reviewed the consent and so decide to participate in clinical trial and sign it, what's going to happen? So typically the first phase is a screening phase. And this can be a variable length, but sometimes can last for several weeks or even longer. And during the screening phase, typically there's many tests that are done to confirm that you're eligible to participate in the clinical trial. These can be scans, they can be blood work, it can be other tests, it can be, in our field, bone marrow biopsies. So that's going to be during the screening phase. Once you've been determined to be eligible, you'll actually be officially enrolled in the clinical trial. And then following enrollment, you'll be assigned to a treatment. So for example, if it is a two-arm study where there's a study or an or investigational arm and then a standard of care arm, you'll be randomly assigned to one of those arms. And then you'll subsequently begin treatment based on your assignment. Once you've started on treatment, then the treatment can be in two different forms. Sometimes it's a one-time treatment. For example, oftentimes in the stem cell transplant world, it might involve a particular type of preparative regimen or conditioning regimen, so the chemotherapy you get before the transplant. So that's a one-time treatment, and it's not going to affect any treatment that happens afterwards. But oftentimes it could be something that is a treatment that extends over a period of time. It might be something you take daily or every week or once a month, and it might continue on for months. Either way, there will be regular visits, and during these visits, you'll be assessed for side effects, and you'll be assessed for response to the treatment. So when does the study end then? So that's going to be variable. Again, the treatment may be one time. It could be a time-limited treatment. It could be 6 months. It could be a year. Most trials will not be indefinite. They'll usually have some time limit. Once that time limit is reached, whether it's a one-time or a time-limited treatment, there'll be a couple of options. Number one is there may be nothing after that. It could be that the treatment just stops and you get followed up. Sometimes there's what's called an open label extension, meaning that they'll offer you, they'll say, you know what, do you want to continue on the medication? And we'll actually tell you, it won't be blind anymore, we'll tell you you're actually getting the medication and you can continue taking it. And this is oftentimes offered to people who seem to be benefiting from the treatment. The other thing that sometimes happens is a crossover. So for example, let's say you get assigned to the standard of care, but it's not working and your cancer is getting worse. You might be crossed over and allowed to get the other treatment. And then there'll always be a follow-up period. So at some point, whether the treatment ends or you stop the treatment because of side effects or because it's not working, there's going to be a follow-up period where they just want to collect information in terms of what's happened, like are there late side effects, how long did the therapy help control the disease, etc. So this is kind of a busy slide, but I wanted to end with talking about every clinical trial does involve participant responsibilities. So there are very important responsibilities that are involved by those who are participating in the clinical trials. I already discussed some of them, and that's predominantly related to reviewing the consent and discussing the study with your doctor. But while you're on the trials, it's important for you to know when the study begins and when it ends. It's important that you show up to all the scheduled appointments on time. And this is because oftentimes the appointments on the protocol are assigned at very specific points of time. You can't even, usually there's some flexibility, maybe a day or two, sometimes up to a week. But that period of having those assessments is very critical. And the timing can be important too. For example, there might be a blood test that needs to be checked and mailed out to go to another state or even overseas. And in order for that to happen, the blood test has to be drawn by a particular time in the day. And so it's very important that you show up on time so those studies can be done. It's important to follow very strictly the directions for proper use, dosing, and storage of any medications you have to take at home. So for example, if it's an oral medication, you want to make sure you follow exactly the directions that's been given. And the same thing for any type of blood samples or preparing for test procedures or exams. There will also oftentimes be medications that you're not supposed to take or can be concerning because it can have interactions with the medications you're taking. So any other medications that you're on, any other medications you want to start, you need to discuss that with your doctor and the site study staff. Any new medical problems that develop or procedures you're going to have, you're going to want to discuss that. And then also I mentioned here that you want to keep the study confidential, and the reason is there may be parts of the study that you're not supposed to disclose to the public. And if you're not sure what you can or can't say, you can always ask the site study staff. And then finally, if there's any changes to your contact information, you want to let them know that. And also, and then if you ever want to withdraw from study, that's always an option. You can always say, you know what, I signed consent, but tomorrow, the next day I decide I don't want to do this anymore. Or 2 months later, or 6 months later, you say, you know what, I don't want to do this clinical trial anymore. You can always withdraw. But if you do want to withdraw, don't just not show up. Make sure you talk to your doctor and follow the appropriate procedures to make sure that everything is done in a safe fashion. So I want to end with a quick example of how clinical research in a specific area has helped and evolved treatment for, in particular with stem cell transplant. And I know I'm running maybe a little over time, so I'll try to do this very quickly. So one problem that we noticed as transplant physicians was that there are many people who lack an HLA-matched donor and then are unable to undergo stem cell transplant. And in particular, this is the case as patients are getting older and having smaller families, they're not going to really have siblings who can be donors. And if you look in the unrelated donor pool, while it's getting better for some groups, for other groups, as you can see down here, I know it's a very small slide, but particularly for African Americans and people of African descent, it's actually very hard to find unrelated donors who are matched. So to overcome this barrier, one solution was, One solution was to use half-matched related donors, so what we call haploidentical donors. And this could be your parents, it could be siblings, it could be children. And so this opens up the possibility for having a donor much wider. However, the problem with this approach is historically it led to high rates of rejection in graft versus host disease. So one idea that came out was the use of this medication, it's an old medication called cyclophosphamide. But in order to use it in haploidentical stem cell transplants, there were a lot of experiments that were done in the lab. And what they found was that you needed to use a very high dose, that the timing of the dosing mattered, so you had to give it after the transplant, and it had to be at a specific point after the transplant. And that the stem cells are actually resistant to cyclophosphamide, so even though you give this high dose of chemotherapy after transplant, that sounds scary, like you're going to kill off the stem cells turn out to be resistant to them. So based on this is kind of how we look at studies. There was this study protocol developed, and essentially people would get chemotherapy before the transplant, a little bit of radiation. They get the bone marrow transplant, and then at day 3 and 4 post-transplant, they would get cyclophosphamide. It's down here on the bottom, 50 milligrams per kg per day. And what they found was that there was very low rates of severe chronic GVHD and acute GVHD, and this was very, very promising. So as a result, what we saw, this is a graph showing the trends in transplant. This study was published in 2008, and as you can see, haploidentical transplants, which is this orange line, weren't really being done. But because of these studies, now there's this huge takeoff in the number of half-matched haploidentical transplants being done. And as these transplants were being done, people started doing observational studies. They started enrolling people in trials, collecting data. In fact, anyone who goes to transplant in the United States usually has their data submitted to what's called the CIBMTR, the Center for International Bone Marrow Transplant Registry. And that data is anonymous. It's collected so that we can analyze what happens to people who get transplants. And so one of the things they looked at was, if you do a transplant from a matched donor or from a half-matched donor, what happens? Again, people are being treated based on standard of care. They're just collecting data to see what happens. And what we saw was a slew of publications come out in different diseases from different places, showing that essentially the outcomes were equivalent. Sorry, I have to go to these because it's not going forward. Eventually, this allowed us to become a little more adventurous and expand this platform to being used in unrelated donors. So there were HLA mismatch unrelated donors, not related donors. And we found, again, that it was very successful. And actually now, most recently, there was a complete large clinical trial that was just completed where we started asking the question that, hey, this post-transplant cyclophosphamide works so well for mismatched donors, maybe we should be using this in everyone, even with a matched donor. And so there was a large trial that was just completed that compared the standard of care, which is tacrolimus and methotrexate, to post-transplant cyclophosphamide-based graft versus host disease prophylaxis. So what we see here is this journey of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, starting initially with lab research, early phase studies, and actually interesting here is that address an important healthcare disparity where a lot of patients who were again, African ancestry or Black weren't able to get transplant. Eventually, a lot of observational studies were done which showed that this to be a promising therapy that was potentially on par with the matched donor transplants. And we're now there's a potential that this might be the standard of care that we use in more types of transplants or even all transplants. So I have this big disclaimer I want to put in that this is for illustrative purposes only. There's a lot of nuances to the use of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, and so I'm not recommending any particular treatment here. There's a lot of individual factors that go into why we pick a certain treatment versus another, or graft versus host disease prophylaxis or another. There's a lot of institutional reasons. And so the point of this exercise was just to illustrate how clinical research evolves the standard of care, but not necessarily to recommend any particular treatment. So in summary, clinical research, as I mentioned, is highly regulated and is very safely done today. There's both observational research and interventional research offer valuable information. Participating in a clinical trial may offer a new or better treatment option. And I underline may because it may not. It's just a possibility. And so that it has to be understood when you go into clinical trial that you may or may not get a better treatment with that. However, in all cases, it does advance the knowledge and treatment of disease, which eventually leads to better medical care. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much for being here for us, Doctor. We'll now hear from Abbey Fueger from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society.
Right. Hi, thank you. And thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here. So today we're going to be talking about how to navigate the maze of clinical trials. And I'm a clinical trial nurse navigator with the Clinical Trial Support Center with the LLS. And we're going to be talking about, really Dr. Alavi did a great job talking about the basics of clinical trials and an overview of that. So we're going to kind of breeze through that with a recap, and then we're going to be talking about some of the barriers to clinical trials, and then how the LLS can help overcome those barriers if you're interested in a clinical trial. So let's get started. All right. So when you first hear about clinical trials, it can feel like navigating a maze. You can have questions about, what is a clinical trial exactly? If a doctor mentions it to you, or if you read about one in an article or see it on TV, what can a clinical trial do for me? Is it a cure? Is it, how do I enroll? Am I going to get a placebo? Is it safe? There can be a lot of questions that pop up. And along those questions, there can also be a lot of barriers that stand in the way of you being able to enroll in a clinical trial. So here we're talking about what are clinical trials. And like I said, we already went over that pretty well with all that great information. But we're talking about, for cancer patients, interventional trials, where you are getting a treatment to treat your specific type of cancer. And again, it's divided into phases. Prior to even starting the clinical trial process, there's a lot of preclinical data that goes into these treatments, a lot of bench science, animal studies, and all of that is given to the FDA so that they can look at it and say, yes, we believe it will be a great treatment. It has the potential to be a great treatment, and we believe that a trial could be run with that safely for patients. And then it begins to go through the phase processes as you've already heard about. All right. So then, what are the risks and benefits of clinical trials? If you're interested in a clinical trial, like all things in life, there's lots of risks and benefits. One benefit is that it's a contribution to your present health and also for the future. I talk to patients every day, and a lot of them say, this may not work for me, but if I can be part of something bigger and it help patients down the road, then that's something that's important to me. So there are a lot of benefits for you at the time, and then also for future science and future health of patients. You may receive early access to new therapies. Every cancer treatment that we have goes through the clinical trial process, so you might have access to those therapies earlier. The drug being studied is free. Now, that doesn't mean the trial is free. That means that the drug that's provided is free, but that all other costs associated to the trial, like doctor's visits or maybe travel, would be covered by insurance or standard of care. You may have access to specialized physicians who are doing research in these particular areas and at the academic medical centers. And you're followed closely with the team, as was already discussed, with the research nurses and the pharmacists, and you're getting a lot of more appointments to make sure that you're safe and also that you're responding to the treatment. Of course, there are risks. There's the possibility that it may not work. There's the unknown fear of side effects. In randomized trials, you may not get to this, you may be get the standard of care arm. And there's also the fear of increased time away from home and family if you have to travel a long distance for a trial. So what are some of the clinical trial myths? You can only join a clinical trial if you've exhausted all other options. And that is not true. Clinical trials are available throughout the whole disease process, from newly diagnosed to heavily pretreated. Clinical trials are not safe, and you will not benefit from them. Clinical trials are designed to give the patient the safest and most effective clinical therapies. You might get a placebo. We talked about that earlier too. They're not used alone in cancer treatment. That would be unethical to just give a placebo. You would always receive at least the standard of care treatment on a clinical trial. And again, that it's free. The drug being studied is free, but you would also have to pay out of pocket, possibly for costs related to travel, and then your insurance would also have to pay for some of that related to your doctor's visits. So what are some of the biggest barriers to enrollment in clinical trials that we see? One could be your health insurance doesn't cover it, that you have a certain HMO that won't pay for you to go to a certain center that has that. It could be that the location of the trial site, you live in California and the trial is only being offered in New York. You don't know about the opportunities. Your doctor has not discussed them with you, or you are not aware of what's going on. You don't really, you're just scared of the overall process of a clinical trial, and that you're going to lose your autonomy and control over your decision making. That it's difficult, and it's very difficult logistically, and it's difficult with having to get into a trial, go through all the process. It can be very daunting. Physicians have barriers too when it comes to recommending clinical trials for patients. And that could be that they don't really know all the clinical trials out there. They're busy, they've got a lot going on, and they may know the trials that are happening at their particular center, but they may not know what's happening at another center. They don't have the time to research all of those trials and have them ready for the patient. And they may have bias related to that. They think certain patients may not be interested in trials when they are. And that might break down the communication between patient and doctor about offering clinical trials. They may not know what trials are currently available, and they may even have concern about losing a patient to another center if they refer them out for a clinical trial. So with all that said, where does clinical trial enrollment stand today? So we know clinical trials are the key step in advancing all cancer treatments. But overall, U.S. participation in cancer clinical trials is low. Only about 5% of adults and 20% of children enroll in clinical trials. And only about 27% of cancer patients are even eligible for clinical trials. And 20% of cancer clinical trials are closed due to insufficient enrollment. So what does this tell us? This tells us there's a lot of work to be done in this landscape here. It's hard sometimes for patients to get onto trials because of eligibility criteria. They have very stringent, because they want to make sure that the patient is safe, and they want to make sure that they have the correct data that they need to move the trial forward. But that can make it difficult for patients to get on. Also, location-wise, it can be hard for patients to get to academic medical centers. They're not offered at their local hospitals, so those also can keep patients from getting on. And with all those trials closing, that means that maybe potential great therapies are not getting through the trial process. So there's a lot of work that we can do here to help and get the numbers up of people that can get into clinical trials and get access to these life-saving treatments. Well, what is that next for clinical trials? We've seen so many changes over the last year and a half with COVID, and how clinical trials are being run, and also just the desire to get out to more people. We're increasing diversity with clinical trial participants. We're modifying eligibility criteria to promote inclusion, and promoting awareness of who's participating in clinical trials. And we're reducing barriers to enrollment, increasing flexibility, having maybe telehealth appointments, doing those some of those local blood draws, so you're not having to go to the sites as much. Anything we can do to kind of help get patients more involved in clinical trials. Right. So let's say you're interested in a clinical trial. Where do you look? Always talk to your doctor. Your doctor has great information. They may know of a clinical trial that you could be eligible for, and that's a great to start that conversation early and often with them. There's also government databases. CT.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, has a list of every clinical trial that is available in the United States. It can be cumbersome to navigate, though. You can go in there and you can put in your disease, whether you're relapsed or refractory, location, all of that, and it will give you a list of trials. But again, if you don't put it in quite right, or something isn't in there correct, it can be difficult to get the information that you need. Drug companies often have their trials listed on their websites. so that you can go through there and find out information about what they're offering, but it would be just for their company and what they have available. And then there are patient organizations that offer clinical trial searches and information. And the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is one of those companies or corporations that offer that. So years ago, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society noticed that we were getting a lot of phone calls from people that were interested in clinical trials and just didn't know where to look. So they'd invested money in the Clinical Trial Support Center, which is a comprehensive patient navigation service. And we are nurses and nurse practitioners that are highly trained in research and in hematology. And we are here to do psychosocial and educational assessments with our patients so that we can provide an individualized, patient-friendly list of clinical trials to patients so they can discuss it with their healthcare team. So it's a collaborative process. To do this, we speak to sites that are having clinical trials at different locations. We speak to healthcare providers. We speak to principal investigators. We speak to the industry sponsors. And we try to kind of overcome those barriers that might be keeping people from getting into trials. And we're here as a personal connection with the patient to help follow up with them through the whole process. So any questions that they have, anything that we can help with, we are here for that. So you can self-refer to our program, and at the end of the presentation, I'll have that information on how to do that. Doctors can make referrals to us. And however you get to us, the process is the same. We will call you. And so what do you expect during that first initial call? We really want to get to know you. We want to know, why are you seeking out a clinical trial? What would be some of your barriers to getting to be on a clinical trial? And we just want to learn about you. Then we do a clinical intake. And this would be talking about prior treatments you've had, your current physical condition, past medical history. All of this information is important because it helps us go through the trials and go through the specific eligibility criteria. That way we get the best information for you. Then we provide education. We will help you understand the clinical trial process, what to expect at your doctor's appointments, what questions to ask. And then we just give you a general understanding of all kind of therapies that would be available to you with your cancer in the current stage that you're in. All right, so then after our initial conversation, we get to work with our database going through the clinical trial searches. And we have our own database that is paired with the clinicaltrials.gov, but it allows us to put more information in. And then we compile it into a document that we send to you. And in this document, it has the doctor that is doing the trial, a brief description, specific eligibility criteria that might be pertinent to you, and also how to locate the trial, how to get more information. And we send all of that to you in a document that you can print out so that you can take it to your doctor and have a discussion about whether or not these trials are appropriate for you. And then after the trial search, we will help guide you to enrollment. We're going to try to get over those barriers. That could be a referral for maybe to an outside organization or even within the LLS for financial assistance. We try to connect you with maybe new patient services, anything we can do to help you get over those barriers that we talked about to get enrolled into the trial if it's appropriate for you. That's what we're here for. We're also here for questions. If a doctor mentions something and you're not quite sure, you get home and you're thinking about it and you're like, I don't really know what that was, give us a call and we'll be there to help you go through that. We're here to provide support to you throughout the process. So last year, there were 9 of us across the country. We are from California to New York, and we helped over 1,000 patients. And to do that, we had over 9,800 interactions, and that's interactions with patients, caregivers, medical professionals, sponsors, all those people to help get the enrollment process going for patients and helping them get to those site locations to enroll in trials. And 20% of our patients enrolled in a clinical trial. And if you can remember back to the beginning of the presentation, that nationally the average is much lower. So reasons that our patients are not able to enroll in trials sometimes are the inclusion-exclusion criteria, they don't meet that. Their insurance, again, does not pay for that. Maybe they were too sick at the time to go on to a trial. They were unable to travel. You've got work, and with COVID-19 this past year, it made it really difficult to get to other places, or they decided to go on a standard of care therapy. All right. So, all that said, though, I want to make clear, though, the goal of the CTSC is not to enroll every patient into a trial. It's rather to increase the opportunities for participation in trials. And what that means is we don't want a patient not to go onto a trial because of a barrier that we could help eliminate. We want to be there to help do that for a patient, and we will do that by working in collaboration. So you can call and just speak with a nurse and see if you could even be appropriate for trial, what's available to you, what's out there, and then within collaboration with your doctor, if there is something that you're interested in, then we will work to help get through those barriers for you. Our goal is to ultimately educate, support, and empower patients to be active participants in their treatment decisions. And then finally, this is how you contact us. You can call the Information Resource Center and then indicate that you're interested in speaking to a clinical trial nurse, and they will make a referral for you, or they'll send you the referral form to fill out for yourself. You can go online and complete your own referral. And then doctors can also, and healthcare professionals can also go online and make referrals for their patients. And in that case, we also call the patient the same process and let the doctor know too. All right, so that's kind of a breakdown of what we do at the LLS. And I thank you for the opportunity today to speak to you all.
Thank you so much, Abby. And thank you to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for all your support. And now we're going to hear from Mike Ansley.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here and supporting National Bone Marrow Transplant Organization again. A very great organization that helps us all out navigate the complicated maze that we're in. So before I give you my perspective on clinical trials, I just kind of want to give you a little background on me. Really, some people have probably characterized me as a little bit of a risk taker. I guess, if you look at my career of sinking ships on purpose while I'm on board them, you would probably see that as taking a risk, but I would call it more of a calculated risk. And that's kind of the way I look at clinical trials. It's a calculated risk that has a possibility of some big returns. 2011 was going to be my big year. I was going to go be the CEO of a submarine or the skipper. I was going to be that guy in the back fishing from my very own nuclear-powered submarine, and I was pretty excited about it. Unfortunately, things didn't quite go according to plan, and I found myself navigating a different test of sorts, going through hyper-CVAD, matched unrelated donor transplant later in the year. But after that, I recovered fairly well. That's a little bit further forward, but the picture on the left, again, back to my risk-taking, that's between cycles of, the far pictures between cycles of chemotherapy during hyper-CVAD, and the pictures on the right are me finally finishing my full marathon with one of my friends that I've been running with ever since. The picture on the left is what I like to call the picture of the standard of care for chronic graft-versus-host disease. At that time, I had to come off of prednisone and go on to solumedrol because they thought I might have some gut involvement in my graft versus host disease. So that moon phase is the results of high doses of steroids. That eventually cleared, and then we ended up back in about 2015, we started noticing this patch of skin on my back, and come to find out that was a different presentation of chronic graft versus host disease, scleroderma. So here's, as a patient, here's some of my reasons to participate. And actually, I think Abbey and the doctor have already talked about a lot of these. I really look at it as a chance to give back. If you look at the people that are recipients of stem cell transplants or experience graft versus host disease, we're still around due to the results of a lot of clinical trials. Some of the stuff I mentioned, hyper-CVAD was initially a clinical trial. Matched unrelated donors were a clinical trial. All of those treatment options didn't exist without the research going into it. There's definitely a chance to improve treatment options and avoid the prednisone, which is bad in itself. There's generally little to no cost to patients. I believe Abbey talked about some of the costs. I mean, it's travel to the centers and stuff like that, but generally speaking, the drugs are usually covered, and a lot of the additional testing is covered as well. The other reason for us as cancer survivors or stem cell transplant survivors to participate is we're already a small subset of a small subset, right? Not everybody that has cancer gets a stem cell transplant. Not everybody that gets a stem cell transplant has chronic graft versus host disease. So we're already a small population. There's a potential that it could improve your outcome. And there's also the chance of pride in knowing that you helped find a new treatment. And I think we also talked about the out of options is definitely something, you know, if there's nothing else, then why not a clinical trial? Some of the pitfalls of clinical trials, there's potential complications. Some are often randomized, and I think the doctor did a good job explaining how randomization works there. It might not work for you. There's going to be extra doctor visits. There's going to be extra labs or testing. The log keeping requirements can sometimes be bothersome because usually you have some data keeping that you have to do. And there's always what happens when the trial ends. Is there a plan B or C that you can call up? Some things that I recommend you do is to do your research, know what's out there on the horizon. You know, talk to your doctor about what they're looking at, especially if you're going into one of the transplant centers. You know, look at journals and stuff like that to see what's being investigated. One of the ways I found out about Rockstar is one, national bone marrow transplant, and two, talking to my doctor, right? So we were working through different options, and we came up with KB25 or the Rockstar clinical trial. Make sure you read through everything. Have your caregiver read through everything with you. Ask your doctor questions, and actually read through everything again just to make sure that you understand everything, and make a list of questions and what the answers were. For me, I've done a lot of clinical trials, specifically for chronic graft versus host disease. I participated in Brubica clinical trial. which I believe is nearing FDA approval. Jakafi, which is, I think, ongoing for approval, and the Rockstar Rezurock, which actually got FDA approved. Sorry about the mistake on that slide with Imbruvica being on there again. I also participated in a couple other clinical trials, one on neutropenic diet and whether the benefits were worth it or not. I unfortunately got randomized into having to follow the neutropenic diet when I wanted to be on the non-neutropenic diet. Effects of exercise on recovery of post-transplant and the use of human growth hormone for immune system recovery after stem cell transplant.
Okay.
And that is it.
Thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate you being here with us today. And I just want to let everyone know, anyone who's gone through a cancer journey, I think you appreciate even more how your health is not always determined by you, how you're feeling that day. And unfortunately, our dear Ray, who was going to be here with us, had to step away. He was not feeling well today. And so I'm just going to briefly highlight what he was sharing with us and excited to share with you. Ray was on, or I'm sorry, in 2019, he discovered a large knot near his hip, and he found out that he had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had 19 hits all over his body. And at one point, his daughter had asked the nurse and the medical team who was caring for him how much time he had. And they had told him he had 3 months to live. However, Ray, he was over 70 years old, but had no plans on going anywhere. And so he ended up qualifying for a clinical trial. And he had said to us that it was actually scarier to him not doing the clinical trial than joining it. Because he really just wanted to be here for his kids and his wife and his grandkids. And so Ray took a leap, and many of you have probably heard of CAR T-cell therapy now. And as a result, here we are, 2021, and Ray is doing really well. He's celebrating a year of remission. He takes walks every day and works on his boat, and his strength is significantly better. And so he really wanted to share that message with you today, but unfortunately, his health did not cooperate today, but he sends his best, and Ray, you are missed. And just remember, as we see the celebration of what's happening with CAR T-cell therapy, people like Ray made a difference in helping to bring that new information to us. So now we are going to go to the question and answer part of our program. Kevin, could you take a moment to tell everybody about how that works?
Absolutely. We're now conducting a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the Ask a Question feature on the left side of your screen. Once again, you may type your question into the Ask a Question feature on the left side of your screen. One moment, please, while we poll for questions.
Okay, and we're just waiting a moment, giving people a chance here. But I send this question to Dr. Alavi to ask us specific questions about how do they know they're making the right decision. Like one person writes in here, how do I know that I've made the right decision with the treatment I've chose? Like this person's talking about genomic analysis and everything, but Dr. Alavi, can you give us any feedback on you would give patients on whether their treatment is effective or not?
Sure. So I guess first of all, it's I don't think this is the platform necessary to give specific medical advice, and obviously without knowing more of the history, it'd be hard to do so. But in general, it's always a good idea to ask questions to your doctor if you have questions about whether or not a treatment you think is the right treatment. I think most physicians are going to have any problem discussing with you the reasons they chose to offer a certain treatment. And if at any point you still have questions or feel uncomfortable, there's never any harm in seeking a second opinion. And so you can always go and seek a second opinion by visiting another institution. Oftentimes you can even, there's platforms for submitting questions to providers online or through other mediums where you can ask questions and provide more specifics in the history. I know you had some questions about CAR T cell or the BiTEs or the bispecific antibody therapies. Again, I can't necessarily recommend without knowing the context of your therapy and the context of your disease, but one thing I can answer is that CAR T cells cannot be manufactured with stem cells that were previously collected. Those are a different type of cell type, and it would have to involve another collection.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. It looks like we're getting a few more questions in here. Another question is, it says, my 7-year-old granddaughter's doing CAR T and CHOP next month for AML. Are you aware of whether this is considered experimental? Even though I know you're not pediatric, so yeah. Is there any thoughts on that, Dr. Alavi?
Yeah, so if it's for AML, not ALL, then CAR T cells are not FDA approved. Children typically are more commonly have ALL or acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and there is a CAR T cell that is FDA approved for that indication, but if she has AML or acute myeloid leukemia, there is no FDA approved CAR T cell, so it may be experimental.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And we will continue to take more questions. If you have a question, feel free to type it in. Kevin, can you remind people one more time, please?
Exactly, Jennifer. We're on the same page. If you'd like to ask a question at this time, please type it into the Ask a Question feature on the left side of your screen. Once again, that is, you can type your question into the left side of your screen in the Ask a Question feature. One moment, please, while we pull for questions.
I'm going to submit one myself to Mike. Mike, is there anything you wish you knew now or knew back then that you know now in regards to going on clinical trials? Or do you feel like it was pretty spelled out? Just anything on maybe what you've learned?
There's definitely some good recommendations from the doctor and Abbey on questions to ask and stuff like that. I tend to kind of really kind of study stuff when I'm in this situation. So I really I was asking about clinical trials very early on, and the fact that, there's a couple times when I found out my initial transplant doctor was doing a clinical trial, and it's like, you should have brought that up. I might have wanted to participate in that one too. But sometimes, you find out that you're not qualified for some of that stuff, and so they don't even bring it up. But you definitely kind of have to know what's out there and know what good resources are for clinical trials. I believe there's a couple of web links that you can use to look up clinical trials. It's definitely also, the other thing that's kind of useful to know, the Resurrect one, I think, was probably the one that made me a little more nervous than most, just because it was so early. That was actually a phase 1 clinical trial. So when you go to look up data on those, and what you find is you'll find data from mice and stuff like that, which is good data, but you definitely need to know that and ask your doctor, how does this relate to human trials and stuff like that. and how are they going to ensure safety during the conduct of the trial. And part of that's the entrance criteria they use for it. I mean, they're particularly like for Resurrect, one of the entrance criteria was kidney function and how well your kidneys were doing. And, you know, sometimes the tests they're doing, there's also a link to, sometimes they do a test because there's a possible side effect to it. Sometimes they do a test because they're hoping that it will improve outcomes. So you need to kind of ask those questions about why am I doing it? You know, for instance, for Resurrect, I have to do PFTs every time. And I think they're really trying to evaluate lung performance over time, and just to make sure there's no impact on your lung performance and or it's helping with lung performance. You know, those are the type of things to ask the doctors.
Thanks, Mike. I have one more question for you too. As far as coping with the anxiety, whether it be a bone marrow transplant, the cancer itself, or a clinical trial, how did you handle the anxiety and the emotional aspect of going through all of this?
Humor.
I'm stretching you today.
Yeah, humor and exercise. I mean, those are kind of two of my coping mechanisms. You know, and quite frankly, I am a glass half full guy and not a glass half empty guy. So I'm kind of always optimistic anyways. And I kind of went into even cancer treatment as I'm already going to win.
That's awesome. Thanks, Mike. Which, by the way, if anyone would like to get some more tips from Mike, I know Mike's done podcasts for us. He's done a blog titled Embracing the Suck, with his military background and just how to stay positive going through all of this. So you can catch that on our website. But I have another question. It looks like for Dr. Alavi. Are CAR T cells approved for treatment of CLL?
So it's actually interesting. CAR T cells, that's actually kind of how CAR T cells started out, was investigating CLL. But now that there's much easier therapies for CLL, it kind of fell in the back burner and was used for more aggressive diseases. But they actually are being studied in CLL again, and will likely be approved. They're not currently approved for CLL right now, though.
Okay. Another one here, doctor, is an auto transplant. This is worded a little differently, but is a transplant of CAR T cells a lower risk than, or is CAR T cell therapy a lower risk than a bone marrow transplant?
That's a great question, actually. And that's a question we all have. And in fact, there's very different risks with CAR T cells and bone marrow transplant. And there have been now, I think, at least 3 studies that are actually randomized studies directly comparing CAR T cells to autologous stem cell transplant. So we will all hopefully know the answer to that question in the coming, 6 months to a year, at least as some of the data from some of these trials start coming out.
Okay, great, thank you. We'll give you another couple of minutes if anyone wants to enter in any questions there. And maybe Abbey, I have a couple questions for you too. One, is there anything you want to tell our listeners today about the supports from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, even beyond the clinical trial programs?
Yes, thank you. Great question. So we offer comprehensive support through our Information Resource Center, which is the number that was on the end of my slides. If you call that number, they can direct you to any kind of support that you need, and that can be support groups. We have a program that can pair you, Patty Kaufman program, that if you're, let's say, a newly diagnosed patient and you're wanting to be paired with someone that's kind of already been through the process and has been through treatments before, they will pair you with that person so that they can kind of work as in a mentorship relationship to kind of help you with questions and things like that. We provide copay assistance for medications. We have things like a CAR-T travel fund where patients who are traveling to long distances to receive CAR-T therapy to help offset those costs. Right now we have a COVID-19 registry trial where we are looking at the antibody levels of patients with blood cancers who have received the vaccinations. So we offer a wide variety of supports outside of the Clinical Trial Support Center. And it's important, I also want to mention that all of these are free to patients and that we're here to answer questions, give advice on we have pamphlets and booklets and all this, all coloring books for kids and different programs that we sponsor with too. So all of those are available by calling the 1-800 number.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. Mm-hmm. I am not seeing additional questions at this time, so we might actually just end a little on the early side, but I do want to again thank everyone that has spoke for us here today. I think everyone can certainly learn from today's program. And then I also want to thank the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for being our sponsor. And I want to let everyone know we will be sending a survey out. If you have any additional programs you would like to hear about, or if there's any extra support you need, we would be happy to help. So I wish everyone a wonderful day, and thank you for joining our clinical trial webinar.
Thank you. That does conclude today's webinar. You may disconnect your line at this time and have a wonderful day. We thank you for your participation today.